So thank you so much for inviting me to contribute to this webinar. And it's also really great to be amongst friends that I haven't seen in a while. I have to start by admitting that this is a vexed area of discussion, and my thoughts are still work in progress. But perhaps what I can do most usefully today is offer some reflections on what is probably the key question on everybody's mind, which is, where did it all go wrong? I bring to this discussion my own experiences of working with some of the most marginalized Black and minority women over the last 40 years. And I see myself as a feminist, anti-racist, and anti-fundamentalist activist who is also located within the broader socialist or progressive left. And I think everybody would agree that we are completely caught up at the moment in the maelstrom of identity politics emanating from the right and left of the political spectrum. It's not a good place to be, because as we can see only too clearly, the logic of identity politics, as one social commentator put it, breeds authoritarianism, not just from above, but also from below. We're witness to the reemergence, obviously, of right-wing forms of identity politics, tied not only to the rise of populism, nationalism, and far-right politics, but also to the rise of religious fundamentalism and to neoliberal processes that perpetuate inequality, discrimination, and violence. None of this is surprising. But what is surprising is the turn taken by many on the left, who also use identity politics primarily to control internal dissent, and in doing so have created their own forms of dogmatism. And the result is a growing culture of fear and intolerance, and a breakdown in solidarity, which was so central to many of the anti-racist and progressive political projects that emerged in the 70s and 80s. Ironically, I believe that what we are seeing is a mirror image of both the left and the right, since dominant currents in both have a common desire to assert difference while simultaneously policing difference. My entry into the politics of identity began with my engagement in anti-racist and feminist politics in the late 70s. And I began my political life working with other progressive Black and minority activists who sought to challenge racism by mobilizing around the term Black in the 70s and 80s. And the term was used in an inclusive way to bring together people affected by histories of colonialism and racism. And throughout that period, the anti-racist fight back regularly saw clashes between the National Front and anti-racists, involving not only Asians and Afro-Caribbeans, but also Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus working together. For example, the defense of Southall in 1979 in the face of racism and fascism depended on connections and a sense of solidarity that was forged around the term Black. Of course, even back then, Black political identity did not go uncontested, but within anti-racist circles, it was generally accepted as a secular and non-sectarian identity, with a focus very much on unity in the struggle against racism across class, caste, religion, and ethnicity. It was a Black politics that borrowed heavily from the American Civil Rights Movement and anti-colonial struggles that had taken place and were taking place around the world. And it was also a political form of resistance that built on earlier workplace struggles by Blacks and minorities. For example, the 70s had seen many strikers across the UK, including in and around Southall, shaking not only management, but also the trade union movement out of their complacency. Strikers at Wolf's and Quaker Oats in Southall, Gutterman's in Perivale, Trico in Brentford, Chicks in Slough, and not forgetting Grunwick's in northwest London. All highlighted a range of problems, including appalling working conditions, poor health and safety, low wages, and management divide and rule tactics. These strikes were really important for many reasons. Firstly, they signaled unity, which was hard fought for, but nevertheless saw not only minorities from different backgrounds, but also white workers joining in. For example, dockers who had once marched in support of Enoch Powell marched in solidarity with the Gromwick strikers. Secondly, it was not only the workers themselves, but also increasingly the youth who took an interest in these struggles. And they paved the way for other struggles against racial violence, discriminatory immigration policies, and the rise of the far right in places like Southall and Bradford, and directly led to the formation of the Asian Youth Movement, a branch of which later went on to form the United Black Youth League. And thirdly, these workplace strikes signaled a wave of activism involving Black and Asian women in particular. Indeed, many of the workplace strikes were led by women such as Jaya Desai, who shattered myths about Asian female passivity. And they were also more remarkable, all the more remarkable, because they were waged by a generation of Black minority men and women who were not represented by the old labor movement and their institutions. And they were critical in forging a secular anti-racist identity in which the issues of ethnicity, religion, and caste had no significance. The emergence of Southall Black Sisters and other Black women's organizations as a key, inclusive, secular, anti-racist space for bringing together women from different minority backgrounds was one expression of that wider political project. We ushered in a wave of Black feminist politics based on race and sex that was seen as a necessity and not a choice. Our aim was to organize autonomously, not to separate ourselves off from other struggles, but to strengthen them. We argued that the pursuit of the universal goals of justice, freedom, and equality also involved being simultaneously attentive to a range of intersecting forms of oppressions, such as that experienced by Black and minority women, because they led to heightened forms of discrimination and powerlessness. However, we also made the point of locating ourselves in wider feminist, anti-racist, and social justice and progressive movements, even though we challenged their blind spots in relation to race, sex, and class. SBS's political position was by no means unique. We were members of a sister body called the Organization of Women of Asian and African Descent, OWAD, which became a critical space within which to form a common agenda based on shared political values of socialism, feminism, and anti-racism. I recently came across their 1980 newsletter, FOWAD, which contains a remarkable statement of intent. It formed the political blueprint for the secular socialist Black feminism that we wanted to develop, and I really think it's worth quoting in full. It says, as Black socialist feminists, it is incumbent upon us to point out that women's oppression is inextricably bound up with the issues of race and class, and that it is right and necessary to tackle all three simultaneously and with equal determination. However, having declared the inextricable links between sex, race, and class, we have the responsibility to carry through the political arguments with regard to feminism. This means that the thrust of our work will have two strands. On the one hand, we will continue to organize autonomously and address the issues we face as Black women. On the other, we must bring a feminist perspective to the work of our comrades in mixed, progressive Black organizations. In this way, we will be raising the consciousness of the Black community within the context of the totality of Black socialist politics. So as we can see, it was this Black identity that also led SBS to successfully mobilize across racial, ethnic, and religious lines around issues of violence against women, which is the dominant issue that confronted us in our frontline work. In 1984, we organized the first public protests against violence against women and girls in Southall and won the support not only of women from diverse minority backgrounds, but also from white majority backgrounds. It was a necessary move in a context where community leaders, including those who saw themselves as anti-racist, kept a tight lid on issues such as domestic violence, forced marriage, and honor-based violence, which were deemed to be private matters to be resolved internally without state intervention. This stance eventually compelled us to mount a robust critique of the official policy of multiculturalism, which created community gatekeepers that denied internal power structures such as patriarchy resulting in women's differential and unequal access to rights and resources within minority communities. And in fact, if anyone asked me, I would trace the beginning of the end of what was progressive Black politics to that moment in the 80s, when aspects of multiculturalism and anti-racism merged into each other and lapsed into narrow and essentialist notions of identity politics. It was a politics that replaced the language of equality and anti-racism with the regressive and crude politics of cultural diversity and representation based on abstract notions of group identity or religious affiliation. Indeed, post-Rushdie, in the context of neoliberalism, the official state policy of multiculturalism has morphed into multi-faithism, in which religion has become the defining feature of minority identity and the primary lens through which minority needs are articulated. In this process, issues of structural racial inequality and socioeconomic disparities are left intact. Religious leaders have gleefully seized the opportunities presented to mobilize people around demands to protect religion, so that it is religion that's privileged over other identities. And this protection occurs at the political, legal, public policy, and cultural levels. For example, since 1989, we have witnessed the rise of fundamentalist and conservative religious identity politics and the corresponding communalization of minority communities, aided and abetted by shifts in state policies on minorities. And the result is twofold. On the one hand, the state legitimizes a profoundly anti-democratic form of representative politics that is dominated by the religious right. And on the other, there is an ever-growing accommodation of narrow definitions of religious identity linked to fundamentalist and socialist and social conservative agendas, in which not only are the rights of women and girls in particular threatened, but so too are core human rights principles such as freedom of speech. Religious identity politics has accelerated the process of sectarian division and even violence, as the events in Leicester showed last year. The conflict that erupted between Hindus and Muslims for the first time, and mainly amongst men, I should add, was driven not only by domestic policies of the state, but also international forces of Islamism and Hindu nationalism, which have succeeded in capturing the South Asian Hindu and Muslim diaspora, deemed to be central to their respective authoritarian projects. And similar processes are at work in relation to other minorities. For example, following the Black Lives Matter protests, much of the challenge to racism has taken a similar turn, one that is reduced to accusations of white privilege, which ignores questions of class within white and Black communities, or cultural appropriation, which seeks to deny cultural syncretism and multiple identities as a natural and dynamic aspect of human cultural evolution. And it would appear that the focus is more on demands for the removal of barriers to individual mobility through, for example, unconscious bias training than about tackling institutional forms of racism. Some of us have been here before when we remember racial awareness training that was all the rage in the late 80s. It was ultimately discredited for distracting from cultural and institutionalized forms of racism, but it seems as if history is doomed to repeat itself. And yet the Black Lives Matter movement could have taken a different direction if the focus had been on creating solidarity. For instance, Black people are disproportionately killed or harmed by the police, but so too are other minorities, poor white people, and increasingly migrants, and even women reporting abuse, as the recent Casey report into the Met Police has so viscerally shown. The Black Lives Matter movement was a vital opportunity to start a conversation about state violence, the lack of state accountability, and police impunity in a neoliberal economy. But instead, in my view, much of it has not been about creating a politics of solidarity. We can't come to solidarity if the first thing we do is point to our differences rather than our commonalities and our shared political values, which can and should be nurtured, even as we interrogate our different social locations. So in both these kinds of identity politics situations, the focus of race politics appear to be on what constitutes the authentic representation of race or religion, while other key drivers of inequality, such as class and race, as highlighted so powerfully by the COVID-19 pandemic, are largely ignored. We are no longer focused on increasing wealth and health disparities, the demonizing of migrants, or with the accelerated dispossession of the working classes, who remain the majority of people, Black and white, in the UK. So identity politics is not about tackling unequal social relations or seeking social transformation for an egalitarian end, but about advancing the interests of identified groups that are driven by antagonism of each other. And added to this complexity is the fact that much of the so-called left, progressive, and feminist academic analysis and even activism is dominated by a simplistic one-dimensional view of anti-racism, Western imperialism, and post-colonialism that focuses solely on state abuses of power, but allows little or no room to critique non-state forms of power and coercion and cultural relativism. I think the problem is that identity politics has become the default leftist position, so that anyone who challenges its logic is viewed with great suspicion and labeled either right-wing and reactionary or racist, and subject to cancel culture and censorship. Identities are placed beyond criticism and closed off from critical interrogation. Keenan Malik has argued that the way the left thinks about campaigning against racism has been captured by identity politics. I would go further and say that the way the left thinks about politics overall has been captured by identity politics. And it was June Jordan who once said, and I've never forgotten these words, when she once said something like, identity politics may have been important to get something started, but it is nowhere near enough in getting anything finished. What she meant was that identity politics is how the civil rights and anti-racist movements and the women's movements and the gay rights movements got off the ground. They were useful as a starting point in challenging the injustices and oppression that Blacks and women and gays and lesbians faced, not as an end in itself, but as a part of a wider radical vision for transformation. I think this vision has all but been hollowed out.